this week. My name is Joseph Courtemanche. I'm an author with the Athontos Ministries Press. The name of my novel is Assault on St. Agnes. And it's the story of a terrorist attack here in the United States. Are there weapons of mass destruction in it? That depends on who you would ask about weapons of mass destruction. In the wake of September 11th, the United States government raced at breakneck speed to reclassify all sorts of strange things you would never have thought of as weapons of mass destruction to be weapons of mass destruction so that they could hammer people and put them in jail far more easily. So back in the day, I have classical training. I was a student at the University of Minnesota. I studied Arabic for a couple of years, and then I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And for the Arabic linguists out in the audience, that's Mahadat Tafayl Lugat. You know it because there were bars at the bottom of the hill, and that's where all the linguists spent their time. But during my time there, I was trained to be a cryptologic technician interpretive. And from 1986 to 1989, I was involved in frontline collection of intelligence against targets in the Arab world. I'm not going to talk about any specifics. I can only pretty much tell you what the Navy and the National Security Agency put on their websites, which is that I was trained to speak Arabic so that I could intercept communications. And that's kind of the end of the story. But the reality of it is I was also a Middle East North Africa analyst. And that meant that during the time I was in Naval Security Group, which is now Information Dominance Warfare Group, I believe, they changed their name like SOX. All of us that were MENA analysts, Middle East North Africa, were required to know the order of battle and what kind of weapons were arrayed against American targets, in particular the American 6th Fleet, and the units that chopped, as we called it, to the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf, during the time I was in the Middle East North Africa shop, was a pretty active place. The Iraqis had a tremendously bad habit of shooting Exocet missiles at all sorts of things, including ships like the USS Stark. There were minefields active across the Mediterranean and in the Gulf because in order to lay a mine, all you have to do is get a bog hammer patrol boat and 5 really strong guys and pitch it over the side. So it winds up in the water, the next super tanker that comes along hits it, or the next destroyer or amphibious transport, and it blows a great big hole in the bottom and hopefully sink it or damage it beyond repair. Were those weapons of mass destruction? No, we didn't view them that way. Back in the 80s, and I think it's still a valid description in many ways, weapons of mass destruction were NBCR, nuclear, biological, chemical, and radiological. Nuclear is pretty straightforward. You're talking about weapons that make a big bright flash on the horizon and cities melt. Biological weapons. There were a couple of different things that were prominent in that world at the time. One of them was smallpox. Smallpox is probably the worst thing you could unleash on the planet right at the moment because nobody's vaccinated for it anymore. It's been eradicated. So some of us who are in our 50s and a few people in their 40s still have a divot, usually on their left arm, where they got a smallpox vaccine as a kid. But there were other agents too. Anthrax was one. Anthrax is very messy. It leaves spores out in fields for, dozens and dozens of years. There are islands off the coast of England that are uninhabitable because the Ministry of Defense went out and tested anthrax on these things back way in the 50s, and they're still not sure that they've managed to kill all of the anthrax spores. Other agents are also usable as biological weapons, and you can run everything from a low-grade infection that you spread through local prostitutes, among other things, to the service members coming into the area, onto things that you can contaminate a water supply with. But biological weapons are very hard to maintain in a weaponized form. They've got a shelf life, and it's a relatively short shelf life unless you have extremely advanced technology, and truly only the major players in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s had those technologies. radiological weapons are thought of as any kind of major contamination you can do. Dirty bombs is how most people would think of them back at the time. And in general, they were strontium and cobalt enhanced nuclear devices that would leave a great big dirty footprint and contaminate an area of countryside or city so that you couldn't use it. Another radiological weapon that got thrown in there, I think mistakenly, were the neutron enhanced weapons designed for use in Germany. And the whole goal of those were you wanted to kill a lot of Russians coming across the border, but you didn't want to blow down the German towns because the Germans were going to move back. So you wanted to do minimal blast and fire damage, but basically turning on a giant microwave and cooking the Russians in their tanks was an okay kind of thing. So those are the weapons that most historically trained intelligence people look at when they talk about weapons of mass destruction. I'd like to add a couple of weapons of mass destruction to that list because they certainly apply in the modern era. One of them is network intrusion, because if somebody, it's like North Korea, they have some very good people in the computer realm, can get in and invade Sony servers and wreck their time. Can you imagine what happens if they unleash themselves on the banking system in the United States? There's a financial panic and collapse, even if it's just for a day or two until they can restore records. And you put everybody out of commission. People would go crazy. You would see mass rioting in the cities. There would be incredible levels of violence. And if you did it in parts of Europe, it would be even worse because the Europeans have even less of a solid infrastructure for food supply to carry them through. Another kind of weapon of mass destruction that I think is very likely to be seen is network intrusion and attacks on the infrastructure of this country. If you can get inside the power grid, which is one of the things I talk about in Assault on St. Agnes, you can take down entire regions of the country. One of the other authors here this morning asked me, is this area under snow in the winter? And the answer is yes. Where we are in Greenwood, Wisconsin, you'll probably in this field have 2 to 3 feet of standing snow, and the temperature will get down significantly below zero. So if you knock out the power grid in this part of the country, the farmers and people in these smaller towns are relatively self-sufficient. They've got generators, they don't all hate each other at some fundamental level so they can move in with their neighbor who has power for a time. They have food stocks available to them, they do just fine. I don't think it would be quite the same sort of thing on the northeast side of Minneapolis. I'm just venturing a guess that when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and there was no running water, there were no lights, there was no heat, and the pipes started to burst in every dwelling and office building of a city of 4 million people, that they'd probably want out. And that's one of the foundations for the book that I wrote. So the entire title of the talk is Mass or Weapons of Mass Destruction and the Islamic Threat or Terrorist Threat. I'm not going to tar and feather all of the nations that follow Islam as saying that they're potential actors at this point in time in a terrorist activity. I think that you have some countries, Saudi Arabia is probably the most prominent one, who have a full and rich nuclear capability that they just don't talk about because they paid the Pakistanis to build it in Pakistan, keep it in Pakistan, and then ship the weapons to Saudi Arabia if they felt threatened. That was always the deal. The Saudis paid for 60% or so of the Pakistani nuclear program and said, if we need these weapons, you've got to bring them and bring them quickly. Now, with the Iranian program getting nuclear weapons in the very near future, and I believe the president's being deceptive when he says it's 15 years away. I think it's probably more like 15 days away. There's a very good chance that the Saudis will feel it's time to at least bring a couple of those weapons on board. If nothing else is true of the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, it's that they like things peaceful and quiet where they can make a lot of money and have a nice lifestyle and not upset the apple cart. So if the Saudi Arabian government, as it's constituted today, came into possession of nuclear weapons, even though they foment and pay for a lot of terrorism around the world, I don't believe that they'd be a terrorist actor with a weapon of mass destruction. On the other hand, nations like Syria who have tried to build nuclear weapons and found out the Israelis knew exactly where the facility was and went and bombed it completely flat a few years ago. The Israelis have a long-standing tradition of leaving a smoking hole in the ground when anybody that speaks Arabic tries to build a nuclear weapon. They have arrangements, although they're all tacit and out of sight, with the Saudi government where they kind of let each other be. There's not the conflict that existed years and years ago. So they don't worry so much about people like the Saudi government or the Jordanian government or even the Egyptian government. But there are nuclear weapons in all sorts of forms around the world. And they come in things as small as an artillery shell. And for anybody that's ever been in the military and seen an actual artillery shell, the warhead of one of those nuclear-capable shells would fit in the space of this round table in front of me. You could lay it out there. It'd be extraordinarily heavy, it would collapse the table. But the fact is, you could stick the thing in the back of a U-Haul van and carry it around the Twin Cities if you wanted to. Which brings me to where the real threat of nuclear weapons slipping into our society exists, and that's in the state of Pakistan. What caused the Pakistani government, which has upwards of 100 usable nuclear weapons, to become such a threat on a terrorist level? Not so much the Pakistani government itself, but its reaction to our elimination of Osama bin Laden. They were really ticked that the SEALs wound up in the middle of their country and killed bin Laden. And it made them realize that in the event that the United States government viewed the Pakistani government as too unstable to manage their own nuclear weapons, we were going to go visit them with Green Berets and SEAL teams and clandestine CIA operatives in the middle of a night, and it would be all at once, very suddenly, and take control of all of their nuclear facilities. We were not going to allow them to turn into a radical Islamic state where the generals were no longer in control on a civilian basis, but instead on a theocratic basis. So the Pakistani solution was as brilliant as it was stupid. They took fully functional nuclear weapons and loaded them in unmarked vans and just drive them around their major cities so that the commandos that they know are coming in their little hearts could never find all of the nukes at one time. So if you're in Karachi, there's a good chance that somewhere on the city streets this day, there's a van driving around, maybe with one or two escort vehicles who are not identified as escort vehicles, and it's carrying a live nuke. And it's carrying the kind of nuke that would take a Green Bay or heavily damaged Chicago, or if you could get it up into an airplane and detonate it over Des Moines, it's going to do some serious damage. Why is that a problem? Well, because if I give you 10 really well-armed Pakistani special forces guys guarding a van like that, and I tell you exactly where they're going to be at 22:37 tonight because I've got the schedule, and I'm part of the group that thinks we need to go and nuke Washington, D.C., I can get 100 of my compatriots involved in the act. We can take out that van, capture that weapon, and get it out of the country in the ensuing chaos. And the next thing you know, it's on a freighter in a container headed towards the United States or off the coast of Israel. This is not a small threat. This is something that could happen today, and it could happen very quickly. The same thing goes if the House of Saud falls in Saudi Arabia. If the Saudis fall, the most likely people to take over that country are people who have formed Al-Qaeda in the past. And they would love nothing better than to have the enormous financial resources of the Saudi government, as well as a couple of functioning nuclear weapons with the knowledge of how to use them. So let's pretend for just a minute that every government that has nuclear weapons today is going to remain stable for the rest of our time. It's a nice fantasy, but it's a possibility. Who else could get a nuke? Who else could make it happen? Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were actually nukes that went missing for a time. The United States government claims that they found them all. I'm not so sure about that. I think there are probably a few that dropped off the map somewhere along the line, and they've got a vague idea of where it is. But if you were a general in the strategic forces of the former Soviet Union and somebody offered you $60 million for a nuclear warhead that you'd written off as damaged during a training incident, and some pieces of plutonium and casing had come back, what if you had most of the components for a nuke? How could you possibly build something so awesome and sophisticated as a nuclear device? You get a couple of really good machinists, and you get a couple of really good engineers, and all the knowledge is out there. Back in 1944, when the Manhattan Project was at its peak, before they'd ever assembled the Trinity device and detonated it in New Mexico, this stuff was like magic. Only the people at Alamogordo really knew how to build a nuke, other than the ones in the Soviet Union that were being told by the Rosenbergs how that you build a nuclear weapon. But now, in 2016, we have a lot of people around the world who have better knowledge of nuclear physics than Robert Oppenheimer had. And if you give them all of the components, they can probably assemble what's called a gun-type nuclear device fairly easily. A gun device is really simple. You take a big chunk of plutonium or uranium, because uranium will work just as well, and it's a subcritical mass. It's not big enough or dense enough to actually create a nuclear explosion. And then you have a barrel, like a gun, and at the other end of it, you have another slug of uranium or plutonium with a massive explosive charge behind it. And when that charge detonates, it propels that slug of fissionable material down the gun barrel. It mates up with the other piece of nuclear material, and you have a critical explosion that will yield anywhere from 15 kilotons or even a kiloton if it's a small nuclear device, what they used to call a nuclear demolition weapon. You could bring that about relatively quickly. There are tons of this stuff floating around in the world. Not all of it got rounded up. Some countries produce incredible amounts of fissionable material every year. And now the Iranians are working on refining it with their centrifuges and making these weapons on their own. Do I worry about an Islamic nuke or a nuke coming from a terrorist state going off in this country? I think it's a matter of time in some ways. Will it be 50 years or 5 months? I don't know. And I'm not going to claim that there's one of them headed to our shores now. But what I am saying is the capability technologically, the knowledge technologically, and the materials are available to people that want to do great harm to Western civilization. But what are more likely attacks? What are the things that you could see happen at almost any time? How many of you here remember an attack on the Tokyo subway system by a Japanese cult some time ago? Yeah, it was sarin gas. Do you realize that any modern state that has a petrochemical industry and can refine their own products can build chemical weapons, nerve gas agents, mustard gas, phosgene, chlorine? All of these things are possible. Right now in Syria, the ISIS forces, and I refuse to call them ISIL, ISIS forces, are using those weapons against their enemies. And the Syrian government really has no hesitation about using chemical weapons on their own people. Nor did the Iraqis, nor the Libyans, nor the Egyptians. And the list of Arab and Islamic states that have used chemical weapons on their own people is long, and it goes back for decades. During the time of the 1967 war and again in 1973, the Egyptians were begging the Soviet Union to send them nukes that they could put under their own control because they needed to ward off the Israelis. And in order to have those kind of weapons, you need technicians that are trained to maintain them because they are very high maintenance devices. So the knowledge and the possibility of those devices being out there, chemical weapons too, is extraordinarily high. Chemical weapons are kind of a pain to use because unless you use very strict controls, you wind up killing yourself in the manufacture and assembly of them. But if you have the proper kind of protective clothing, you could get the raw components to make a binary style weapon. And binary just means you take two semi-non-lethal components and mix them at the end and release it in a large city. And if you had a couple of tanker trucks that had a false compartment in them and brought in those components, you could drive it across the United States and the DOT would never find it at any truck stop. The things that we have are all on the perimeter of the country looking to keep threats out. But once you get it in, and there are undoubtedly ways to get anything in, or we wouldn't have such a huge problem with methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine. If you can get it into the country, it can be dispersed and used here. I think the more likely attack that we're going to see than either one of those. And it involves a weapon of mass destruction that we will probably never be able to stop, is a human-style assault, like we saw in Nice, France, or like the one I predicted in Assault on St. Agnes, where if you were to gather, say, 400 mujahideen here in a nation of 330 million people, I could lay waste with 300, 400 fighters that were adequately trained with just small arms to a place like Greenwood, Wisconsin, and make it go off the map. Would I lose some people? I absolutely would. And then I'd move down to Neilsville and I'd slaughter as many people as I could there. And what you'd wind up with is national level chaos, because how can you possibly protect every small town, farm village, and medium-sized town in the United States of America from that kind of attack? Well, you'd have a hard time spotting them coming in if they all converged on the interstates throughout the course of the night and went after an attack like this. But in a big city where you have hundreds of thousands or millions of people, an attack like that could be levied fairly quickly and fairly easily. And I think those attacks using bombs and guns and people with machetes and all of the other nice things that the Islamic State terrorists use are very likely. It's going to happen. It has happened. There have been incidents throughout the United States over the last 10 years that simply did not make the news media because they chose not to cover it. There was an explosion in Minneapolis a couple of years ago that, if you're wondering on YouTube why I'm looking out at the distance, it's because that horizon has just turned completely black and it's going to be here in about 15 minutes, I'm guessing. Yeah, not good. And my car is over there, so I'll be hiding in my car. There was this Minneapolis, and it took place in the Cedar Riverside area, which is absolutely chock full of people from third world countries that have emigrated to the United States. And this explosion blew up an apartment building, an old brick building right near the University of Minnesota, where I'm a proud graduate. And within days, the entire building had been demolished. They said it was unsafe to leave the wreckage there, and doggone it, those stupid people from the gas company let a leak take place. Okay, I've lived in Minnesota on and off for most of my life. I have never seen them demolish anything that quickly in my life. The house next door to me sat abandoned for 3 years before they got around to tearing it down, only after it had become the largest pigeon coop in St. Paul. Xcel Energy, the people who managed the natural gas system in that area, came out the day after the explosion and said, "There's no way that that was our gas, I'm telling you." And that's the last thing we heard from Xcel Energy, because they just demolished the building and made it all go away. The fact is, there was a guy in the building who was a known bomb maker for an Islamic terrorist group. So how much brain power does it take to put 2 and 2 together on something like that? And I know people will say, well, this guy's just some Christian alarmist at some Christian arts festival. No, I'm a trained intelligence analyst, and mind you, I've been out of it for a long time. But I can still look at satellite photography and tell what's going on, and I can read the news, and I can see what's being said in the local community. And the reality we're facing is that you don't need a nuke to do incredible amounts of damage. I could take down the power grid again with those 300 or 400 armed soldiers in a heartbeat and wipe out the Mall of America and blow up the major gas pipelines that serve the Twin Cities. All of it in my book, and I've had people who are still in the spook world that really were kind of angry with me for saying, well, I could do these things. And you know what? I did it all based on knowledge I've gained since I've left the military. These things are just simply what's possible. I don't need to go back to any code word level briefings I ever got, or tell you about any of the weaponry that I studied while I was on active duty. But if you look deeper than what the surface of the news is presenting, and you realize that every time there's an attack, whether it's with knives, guns, trucks, whatever, the first thing the press and the local governments run out and say is, well, we're not sure that there's any terrorist connection, and we'd like you not to panic, and by God, don't be having any Islamic backlash. And then 3, 4, 5 days later, you find out that this guy made the dry run before, and all of his friends say, you know, he was pretty radicalized at that mosque he belonged to. And you start finding more and more of that, and then it's quickly turned to, yeah, but he was a complete nut job and he hated his wife, and he wasn't really a very religious guy. So you have to choose what you're going to believe and who you're going to believe as your sources. So I've touched a little bit on nuclear and chemical weapons. Biological weapons, I really don't think they present a great threat to the United States, simply because we're such a spread out country. It's hard to get any weaponized communicable disease to transmit across a nation this large. If it looked like there was a threat like this taking place, unless it was a state actor like China or the Soviet Union that could really pull this off in a major sort of way with hundreds of episodes simultaneously across the country, I don't view that as a huge threat. But a radiological weapon, where you take a dirty bomb, which is just a conventional explosive that you wrap in nuclear waste, you set it in the middle of a town somewhere and you detonate it, or you detonate it next to the reservoir that feeds all of Manhattan or all of Los Angeles, and you contaminate the water supply. It's the psychological effect. You can clean it up fairly easily, you can filter for it, you can dump those reservoirs and find alternative sources for a time to clean it up, and the actual threat of radiation and the amount that individuals are going to get is incredibly low. But are you going to drink the water if you find out that a terrorist dirty bomb has been detonated in the reservoir that feeds your city? Are you going to be downtown Minneapolis if you find out somebody's put radioactive cobalt isotopes out in a large quantity with 2 or 3 weapons scattered around the rooftops of Minneapolis, where they've taken powdered radioactive isotopes, strontium, cobalt, any of the things that you'll find in a typical cancer ward, and they've ground it up into fine powder and spread it throughout the skyways in a city like Minneapolis or in a Mall of America type setting? Absolutely nobody in their right mind is going to go to these places. You'll destroy them economically. It will be the end of the argument all the way around. And now I have to ask a Tony question. How am I doing for time?
It's 11:45 or 10:45.
10:45. I can babble for 15 more minutes, but my prognosis that the storm was coming in 15 minutes being optimistic, it looks like it's going to be right on top of us in a minute. So let me just wrap up. The simple fact is there are a lot of states that are Islamic, like the fine folks in Iran, that have access to weapons of mass destruction. Will they use them in a terrorist capacity? I would suspect the Iranians would be just absolutely delighted to have their surrogates do it, but not them as a nation state. The Pakistanis, again, I don't think they would do it, but they have surrogates that they would like to see do it. There are a lot of really wealthy Islamic nations, Indonesia among them, that have absolutely no interest in doing anything like that. I guess the blessing of all of it is most Muslims are like most Christians. They're there in name only, they're there for societal reasons and cultural reasons, but they don't practice it at the fundamentalist level that people sometimes practice Christianity and others practice Islam. And the big difference is if you fundamentally practice Christianity and follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, you're going to love your neighbor until they're so tired of it that they either convert or tell you to leave their home, and then you just leave your copy of the Watchtower behind. If the Islamic forces come and say, well, we'd like to talk to you about conversion, they're going to give you options. You can convert, and if you elect not to do that, then you can pay a really big tax and be what they call a dhimmi. And it's the jizya is the tax. And basically they make it unpleasant for you to live in their society as a non-believer. And the third option is that you die. And that's what's happening to the Christian people in Iraq and Syria right now in many areas. Groups like ISIS and their local flavors are wiping Christians off the map. They call them Nasranis. And Nasrani is an insulting form of the word Nazarene. And it identifies Christians as being followers of Jesus Christ, that guy from Nazareth. Because you wouldn't want to refer to him as the Messiah or as God, or even as Jesus Christ. They would prefer not to do that. But if you find a great big letter N or Nun in Arabic painted on the front of your house, and you're a Christian and you live in a predominantly Muslim area, it might be time to see if Atlas Movers can come and get you to San Diego. Because somebody will be coming to blow up your house or kill everybody in your house very shortly. And for people watching this in the West that think that that's crackpot stuff and it never happens, I personally know people that had to leave those nations because they found out they were on death lists. And it happens. And they exterminate villages and families and entire neighborhoods. They'll bomb them from the air, they'll just come through and kill everybody around simply because of their faith. And thankfully in 2016, most Christians aren't interested in doing that sort of thing. But are they state actors, and do they have access to weapons of mass destruction? Thank God most of them don't. And I'm hoping that for as long as I'm alive, we don't see those weapons of mass destruction come to the shores here. Because they do exist, they're fairly easily constituted, and it could happen within months of somebody getting the idea to go forward with it. All you need is a sufficient quantity of cash and the right people to provide the materials. I'd like to thank Tony and the folks here at Athantos Ministries for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to encourage you to go to Amazon.com and buy my book, Assault on St. Agnes. And if you don't want to spend the money and do that, then go to my blog, commotioninthepews.com, and read whatever drivel I'm putting up there this week. Hopefully there will be something entertaining and amusing, and if nothing else, you might just win a chance to get a jar of my homemade jam. So I'll open the floor up for any questions. Yes, sir.
What can someone like in my situation, just a Christian in the West, do to help support those, as Paul tells us, consider those that are in bondage, bond themselves, support maybe some fellow believers in the East, or heavily run Muslim countries?
The question is, what can we do as Christians in the West to support our brothers who are suffering under Muslim domination? There are some refugee organizations that specialize in helping Christians. Unfortunately, the United Nations is in charge of the refugee problem, and because the United Nations doesn't want to argue with the local Islamic authorities, they put the local Muslims in charge of the refugee camps, and then the local Muslims get to pick who comes out as a refugee. And it's just amazingly strange how few Christians they pick to come out of those countries. So they're stuck there. If you know of a good church, or you can find some organizations that will help people get out of those countries, it's a cash-intensive thing because the UN isn't supporting it. They have to be almost private rescue efforts. But there are, and I couldn't give you the name of an organization right off the top, but there are organizations that help provide support. And the storm's here. I'm going to go back and watch the video and see how close I was to the 15-minute time. All right, other questions? Okay, thank you. Now, the digital end. So I'll wrap it up at this point. Thank you all for coming out today, and stay inside the tent for a little while.